Hi, my name is Katie and welcome back to my booktube channel. Today I'm going to be talking to you about my favourite non-fiction books that I read in 2020. In 2020, which is now last year, I read about 18 non-fiction books and I've picked out my favourite 7 for you today. I'm going to run through them in order that I read them and I would say they were all 5-star reads. I loved them all and I thought that they were each brilliant in their own ways but very different. So I will say that a lot of them are memoirs, but even within that there is such a range of different voices and different lived experiences that I read about. So yeah, let's just get into it and we'll see how we get on. Okay, so the first book I'm going to talk to you about is The Last Act of Love by Kathy Rensenbrink. Now this is a memoir of Kathy's life and particularly paying attention to her youth and her friendship and relationship with her brother and how that is changed forever by a car accident that he is in. So he is knocked over by a car when he's a teenager, and this leaves him in a permanent vegetative state. And it's basically about how the family cope with this new person in their family who was the brother but doesn't now feel like he is the same person. Basically he's gone is what they kind of talk about, and it's about how the family cope with this period between life and death and the trauma that they go through as a family, trying to seek out the right kind of care and support for the brother. One of the things that I did really appreciate about this is that there are moments of joy, and the relationship between Kathy and her brother is very much like a very moving story. And it's also about how she grieves him while he's still alive, and then how she learns to let him go. So it's very sad. It's very, very sad book. But I'm really glad I learned it, and I'm really glad I read it, because I did learn a lot about that process in terms of people who have been through serious accidents and then are coping with that trauma. And also there's a period where I put a little spoiler on the screen here, so skip forward if you don't want a little spoiler of what the outcome is, what actually happens in this book. But essentially what happens is the family have to find a way to end the son Matty's life, and this is now medically normal, but at the time that this was written this wasn't normal. And so Kathy and her family go through a lot of trauma in terms of trying to let go of Matty, trying to come to terms with his death. It's just a lot for them to cope with as a family. I think this is really beautifully written. Kathy has a very straightforward and simple writing style, which I think, given how difficult this is to read in terms of subject matter, the writing really helped to make it like accessible and readable. And it was one, as I say, I flew through it, and I would really recommend it, but definitely make sure you're in the right headspace, because it was sad. It was definitely sad. The next book I want to talk about is called My Name is Why, and it's by Lem Sensei. Now this is a book about Lem Sensei's life. So Lem is born to a mother who is not British, but he's born in Britain, and he's taken into the care service basically against his mother's will. It's basically like he's been forced into the system. Again, I listened to this all in one go. You can tell that there's definitely a theme here, but I listened to the audiobook of this, and yeah, it's basically about Lem's life and how he copes in the system. So he's fostered, I believe. I don't think he's fully adopted, if I remember rightly, but he's fostered by a white family, and Lem is black, and it's about his acceptance within the family or lack of acceptance, the way the family treats him, the struggles he faces, the prejudice he faces, the assumptions that people come at him with. One of the things I really liked about it is it's got multiple people narrating the story, and some people play like the social worker's voice, and they read aloud actual files that are filed in Lem Sensei's folders when he was in care. So for me this is a really good read, especially if you work in the care services or if you in any way work in a role where you keep files on people, because it really makes you think about the consequences of the notes that you write, the notes that you take. I used to work with women with convictions. I used to work in prisons, and I was responsible for note taking about the people I worked with and recording case notes and things like that. So for me, it got me thinking about that on quite a deep level, and thinking about like the kinds of things that somebody could put in a file and what influence that could have on that person's life outcomes and how important those roles are. It's such a deeply moving book. It is. I want to reread it, re-listen to it, especially because the narration was just fantastic. But it's so sad. It's really sad. But thankfully, in the end, Lindsay finds out more about himself, finds out about his birth, finds out about his mother, his birth mother, and finds a bit of a happier ending. But I think what I took away is he found a happy ending despite the system he went through. In no way did the care system help him. In fact, the way he was treated in the British care system as a black young man was absolutely atrocious, and I'm sure that there are still instances where people are treated like that today. There's a long way to go, and it's definitely one to read if you're interested in those kind of topics. Another heavy one, there's a lot of heavy non-fiction books here, but the third one I want to talk about is called Breakfast at Bronzefield, and it's by Sophie Campbell. That's a pseudonym, is that how you say the word? Basically when they write under a fake name. And this is a memoir by a black British woman who has experienced time inside British prisons. She actually lived within the largest prison for women in Europe. It's based in England, and I think it's the only memoir I have read by a woman in a British prison. I think it might be the only account of a woman in prison that is published. How are we here? How is that the case? How is that the case? There are so many instances where middle-class men find themselves in prison, and they come out and they write a memoir all about their experiences, and you do not hear enough voices of women coming out of prison and hearing their story and their experiences. And that's one of the things I value the most about Sophie Campbell's memoir. I feel like this is a voice that's not heard enough, and I'm glad that she was published. What annoys me is that this had to be self-published. This was not picked up by a publisher. There's a chapter in the book where she talks about the publishing process and how she had to, like, the publisher wanted her to change the way that she was approaching speaking about herself, and the publisher wanted her to focus more on racism, and she felt like she didn't experience racism in prison. But the publishers wanted to spin it that way, sort of thing. And that irritated me as well, that they felt like they had to control the narrative. And I do think that that's really interesting about commercial publishing in particular, in terms of what sells, what doesn't sell. And I think that's an interesting discussion. I'm not the person to lead that discussion, but I think it's interesting to think about and to reflect on the books you're reading, why those narratives were pushed forward, and what other narratives are we not hearing because publishing don't think that they're commercial enough to be sold. So this was definitely one that I would like a physical copy. I'd like to buy a physical copy at some point, because I think it's such an important piece, and I'm really hopeful that it will lead the way for more women with convictions to tell their stories. It's extremely difficult reading in places, so do check content warnings. There are a lot of topics, including like sexual abuse and things like that go on through the book, particularly the ending where she comes to leave prison and the struggle she faces to find her way. I've got a lot of respect for Sophie Campbell for continuing to move through all the challenges she was faced with. I have deep admiration for her for that. So yeah, it's a deeply personal memoir, but I would highly recommend it. The fact that it's self-published don't let that put you off, because it's just literally a case of publishers deciding what narratives make the mainstream, which pisses me off. But there we go. So the next one I want to talk about is called I'm Afraid of Men by Vivek Shraya. I think that's how you say the name. It's a Canadian author, and I've read quite a lot of her works last year, and I just fell in love with her writing. I think she has such range in terms of what she produces, and it's just incredible. I'm Afraid of Men talks about the ways in which men perpetrate violence against non-males. It talks about gender, it talks about how someone can sit on the intersection between male and female and in some contexts can be seen as not male enough, but then can be seen as too male. So for instance, I actually, in my journal, created a whole spread, this is one of the very few books I did this for, and it's still my favourite spread in my journal from last year. So this is it here, if you can see that. I read it in July for a readathon called Transathon, which focused on trans and non-binary authors. So Vivek Shraya, if you don't know, is a trans author. One of the quotes that I wrote down on this page is, "Reclaiming my femininity in these small and large gestures has been a crucial part of my transness and my healing. How cruel it is to have endured decades of being punished for being too girly, only to be told that I am not girly enough." I think it really speaks to the ways that gender is weaponized against people, and I think it's really powerful. For me, it also speaks to male-generated violence and how that affects the entire of society. It also talks about like masculinity as being like colonial in a sense. So the theme of entitlement to space that emerges in many of my recollections of men is colonial code for claiming someone else's space. That really spoke to me, that there was quite a lot of these quotes that really spoke to me on a very deep level and really moved me. And that's the reason I would probably say that's my favourite non-fiction book from last year. I just thought it was absolutely phenomenal. And I think it should be essential reading for everyone. I really feel like that book is something that can help people and be a useful tool for examining masculinity and toxic masculinity in particular, and the ways that masculinity is weaponized against certain groups and communities and people. So that's that one. The next one I want to talk about is called Afropean, and it's by Johnny Pitts. Now this is part travelogue, part social commentary, and it follows Johnny Pitts on a journey as he makes his way around Europe, examining the history of Black people, the history of Black culture in Europe. It's really like beautiful. I don't know how else to describe it. I listened to Johnny Pitts' audiobook of it. It's narrated by himself. He has a really nice accent and way of speaking, so it's like really easy to listen to and really enjoyable to listen to. So that kind of helps the enjoyment factor of it. But really it's just, for me, I found it really interesting to think about race and racism in Europe as opposed to looking at it always from an American perspective, which is a lot of what the narrative we hear is either American or British focused. And I like that Johnny Pitts, although Johnny Pitts is British, he went and travelled Europe elsewhere on mainland, and I think he went to Sweden. Sweden was one of his places. I think he went like most of the mainland countries, like bigger countries in mainland Europe, and he speaks to people and he meets with community members and people who organise groups and people he just meets on the street, people he meets on the train, like people he meets in bars, and he talks to them about their experiences and he talks to them about just basically what's their life like in this country as a Black person. And yeah, it's brilliant. I mean, it's really quite moving in places. It won the Jalak Prize, which is an up-and-coming literary award, which is really worth paying attention to. But it won that in 2020, and I can see why I think it should be winning more awards. To be honest, it's such an exceptional piece of non-fiction, and I'm glad to see it being translated into like German and French, and I think I've seen a few other languages it's been translated into. He had also an exhibition, I think, I'm sure it was Holland. He had it, and it was like a photo exhibition. So I would like to buy the physical book of this, because although the audiobook was brilliant, I would like to have the physical book because I believe that there's pictures within it, and I would like to read it again and look through those pictures and just see how that reading experience compares, because I think it will be different, but I think I'll get something more from it as well, like a different element of the book. So I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah, that was exceptional. Now, the sixth book on this list is Motherwell by Deborah Orr. Now, Deborah Orr is a Scottish journalist who moved to London and has now sadly passed away. She passed away, I think, at the end of 2019. And this book was published after her death. So it was published, I think, in the January of 2020. And this is the book that basically tells you a lot about Deborah Orr as a person, as a child growing up. This was again another one I listened to on audiobook, and the narration, I think the narrator's called Gabrielle Quigley. I think that's how you say her name. The narration is exceptional. It's absolutely beautiful. One thing I really miss about Scotland and about my home is that Scottish accents. I'm hearing Scottish accents, and I think just like letting myself get lost in this little audiobook for a while, it helped me connect to Scotland again and the Scotland that I miss. So I was glad that that was an experience I was able to have last year. Some of the things I really like about this, so if you are not from Scotland, Scotland is quite romanticised. So people often write books about going to Scotland and it being this like little wonderful place, and the men are in sexy kilts and the women are like starting up bakeries, and everyone's owns their own bookshop, and it's very, very heavily romanticised. And I often find those depictions of Scotland a wee bit difficult, because I know that Scotland is not totally like that. Like there are other elements of Scotland that aren't commercial. Like I was talking earlier about commercialism. There are some elements of Scotland that aren't commercial. And I think that what Deborah Orr kind of leans into and talks about is some of those things that I see as culturalisms of Scottish culture, that are less commercial, less sellable, less sexy, I guess. And one of those comes from kind of trauma related to war that's passed down through the generations, and the way those people carry that, and the kind of spirit of like, don't expect more than your lot, like just don't be ambitious, like just stick with what you've got. And I don't know if this is just a kind of working class attitude. Like my parents came from working class backgrounds, I would say. Deborah Orr's background is very similar to my parents' background in many ways, in terms of the location and the time that she was brought up in, and in terms of the kinds of culturalisms that she learned. And what it helped me reflect on is how those culturalisms, how I have inherited those culturalisms, and how I have internalised certain messaging that I wasn't necessarily aware of. Yeah, how Scottish culture has both benefited me and hindered me in some ways. I often think reflecting on that kind of stuff when you're living elsewhere is very interesting, because you pick up different things from different cultures, and then it gives you a different look on where you came from and who you are. Some of the stuff in this novel hit home very, very heavily for me, and some of it was very different than my own lived experience. But I think part of the reason it made this list is because so much of it, or quite a lot of it, did hit home very heavy for me, and I related quite hard to Deborah Orr in a lot of ways. Not all the ways we are different. I felt a deep connection, and that's why I included it on this list. Now the final one that I've included here is called The Louder I Will Sing by Lee Lawrence. I saw this one, was it the memoir category or the non-fiction category? I think it was memoir category for the Costa Book Awards, and I'm really glad to see that. I hope that means that more people will read this book. It's a 2020 release. I read it in November, I think, and I read the ebook, and this was another one I absolutely flew through. So this follows Lee Lawrence's battle for justice for his mum. So his mum, Cherry Gross, was shot in a police raid on their house, and it's about her fight. So she was left permanently disabled by that, and it's about the family's fight for justice and for recognition by the police service, and for some kind of retribution in that process. And it was deeply moving. One of the things that caught me is the quote, and I think it's from a piece of music, and he says, "The more you refuse to hear me, the louder I will sing." And that's where the title of the book comes from. And for me, a lot of it is things that I knew about, like police, institutionalised racism in the police service, and the way that impacts certain communities in certain areas. Like I think this is set in Brixton, in London. And it also follows Lee Lawrence's journey in terms of trying to reform the police. So he tries to work with them to basically cut through their stereotypes and like work with them on more like community policing kind of stuff. And I just really admired him, I suppose, for having the kind of strength to go through that process, especially in light of everything that he has been through personally with the police, to then want to make that change and want to kind of think about how he talks about the police and how he can make communities better. I did admire that. I don't think it's his responsibility in any way, shape or form, but I admired that he had that strength to do that. It's just a very like beautiful memoir. Again, it's very like simple writing, but I found that I could almost hear Lee Lawrence speaking to me. Like his voice, his writer's voice is so powerful. It felt like he was actually telling me the story. Some of the things that he's talking about, it's as if time hasn't passed. Like this is in the 80s, but it's as if time hasn't passed. Like the way people on low incomes are treated, the way disabled people are treated by benefit systems, and by support welfare states and stuff like that. It's really quite difficult to read about, especially, I mean, in the time that I read it, it was just after, I think, that they had decided they wouldn't be giving children school meals through the summer, and what a difficulty that was for a lot of families in the UK. So yeah, a brilliant read. I hope that, because when I read it, it was obviously quite a new release, and there's still not a lot of people who've read this, so I really hope that the Costa Book Award actually gets more people to put this on their TBR and to read it and to learn about Lee Lawrence's story. I think it's a very important one, and is one that anyone who's interested in social justice issues, in particular to do with the UK, should read this one for sure. So that's really all the 7 books that I had on my list. I hope you might have discovered something new, or something you haven't heard of before, or something that just piques your interest and takes your fancy. And if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought of them, and if you read any brilliant memoirs or non-fiction books, because I realise a lot of these are memoirs. If you read any good ones last year, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. So thank you for watching, and have a great day.